Good afternoon and welcome again to another Working for You program. I am Les Roy Williams. Thank you very much for joining us for our program today. Of course, your company is appreciated from week to week. So thank you very much for being with us. Today we are going to be having a discussion on the role and impact of UNESCO in the Federation. Of course, UNESCO is a body that stands for the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. And it has been doing a lot of work and partnering with St. Kitts and Nevis in many different areas, which will be the focal point of our discussion today. I have on the panel Ms. Dorothy Warner, who is the Secretary General of the St. Kitts and Nevis Commission for UNESCO. Welcome very much.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. I'm happy to be here.
And I have Mrs. Telka Wallace. She has been here on several occasions up to recently. And Mrs. Wallace is the project coordinator for the Man and the Biosphere project. Welcome, Mrs. Wallace.
Thank you very much, Mr.
And then I have His Excellency. It's not always that we have ambassadors on this program, but I have His Excellency Dr. David Doyle, who is St. Kitts and Nevis's ambassador to UNESCO. Welcome to all three of you.
Thank you.
Right, so UNESCO has been doing a lot of work here in St. Kitts and the Nevis, and we want the people in St. Kitts and Nevis to know of the work that UNESCO is doing, and we want the world to know of the work that UNESCO is doing and the technical assistance that it is offering. So I will begin by asking my very first question. What technical assistance is UNESCO providing to the Federation, or has provided, because it's ongoing?
I can tackle that question. UNESCO has been offering technical support in a lot of different areas, primarily in the area of the participation program projects. And we see that over the years we have benefited from a lot of the funds that UNESCO has sent on the ground and of the technical assistance through consultants who have come to do capacity building in terms of policy development, etc., etc. We speak of policies like the youth policy. We talk about the sport policy that was finished in 2020. We have just completed the gender policy. It took 2 phases. We have the gender policy that's just been completed. And we have also had assistance in education, where we are looking at the professionalizing of the teaching force. And we look at support to the culture department and the development of culture in terms of the intangible cultural heritage and all those other social sciences and so on. And UNESCO is really doing quite a lot of work in St. Kitts Nevis, and the people are benefiting. And so we are saying that we want to be able to, in this program and every day, to let people know what UNESCO is doing so they can further support and appreciate UNESCO, to kind of raise the visibility of UNESCO in St. Kitts and Nevis.
Right. Dr. Doyle, you wanted to add to that, to give you a perspective? Yes.
Before doing so, please allow me extend my condolences to the family and the citizens of the Federation on the sad demise of your former Premier of Nevis. Yeah, just before I came to St. Kitts and Nevis on this trip, which is on both a mission and to take a few days holidays, I received 3 bits of very interesting news with regards to 3 specific, very tangible projects which are being funded and are the object of the provision of technical assistance to the Federation. The first, as was already mentioned by Ms. Warner, intangible cultural heritage. This is one of the flagship projects of UNESCO. It helps member states like ours to identify, document, preserve, conserve, promote all forms of intangible cultural heritage. It's largely focused on creative industries, folklore industries, but also objects and items, music, singing, etc., for which this country has a very, very rich heritage. And it was pretty obvious, I think, to the former Minister of Education and Culture and Sports that we needed to seriously consider engaging more actively in the Intangible Cultural Heritage Project, so for which we now are awaiting the outcome of a review of a submission that St. Kitts and Nevis put in just some 6 weeks ago for technical assistance worth $100,000 US. So the stakes are huge. And this fund will be, of course, vested with the National Commission for UNESCO under the auspices of Ms. Warner for the purposes of actually elaborating and developing a dedicated, tangible, intangible cultural heritage policy framework, which we don't have. This needs to obviously be presented to the Cabinet sometime towards the end of 2023 when the project is complete, for obviously ratification by the government. But it's a huge step in the right direction in terms of technical assistance that we receive from UNESCO. Now we have two very able focal contact persons here on the ground, Miss Marlene Phillips in St. Kitts and Mr. Patrick Howitt in Nevis, who have worked in a sterling fashion to ensure that we actually submitted the project proposals on time. We were rushing up to the very last moment to get it in, but all is well, and hopefully we will be hearing from UNESCO soon in terms of the outcome of this project. The second project, this time it's the follow-up to a project in relation to developing a sports policy framework for the Federation, something which we don't have, but which UNESCO over the last 2 years has deployed a high-level consultant from the region, as it happens, with enormous experience, as a very seasoned consultant to assist the Ministry of Sports and the stakeholders to develop a series of recommendations as to how the Federation could develop again a dedicated, structured sports national sports framework. Now, the follow-up to this is actually being undertaken by the Commonwealth Secretariat in London, whom we have lobbied, and I'm glad to be able to announce that the Commonwealth Secretariat, have agreed to fund some technical assistance over the next 18 months, the deployment of yet another consultant who will be coming here, working alongside the stakeholders in the sports field of activity, the Ministry of Sports, and other related parties, to actually implement some of these recommendations. For instance, the creation of a National Sports Council that will oversee the development of a strategy and its implementation, and something like 3, if not 4, from memory, sports hubs which will be set up across the Federation to enable the development of excellence in sport activities directed at the youth, but also directed at the general population. So again, another example where we have excelled in terms of expertise. And if I may just add a third, and again very recent development just before I left Paris, and this relates to the World Heritage program. Now, as you all know, St. Kitts and Nevis is already well endowed with the Brimstone Hill fortress, which was inscribed back in the early 90s. We're now looking at identifying from a list of existing well-documented historical heritage sites across St. Kitts and in Nevis, and a number of sites that could be considered as being eligible for consideration by UNESCO, ultimately to be put forward to the World Heritage List. Now, just before I left, we received, and Minister Powell received, confirmation from UNESCO to the effect that the UNESCO will be providing, once again, a very high level of technical expertise in the area of World Heritage, something which we sadly lack here in terms of magnitude, in order to be able to help us identify those important historical heritage sites across the Federation, be able to document them, be able to ensure that they meet all the World Heritage criteria. That will be starting, Mr. Williams, very soon. We should have consultants on the ground here, in fact, as early as summer.
Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador Doyle. Now, yesterday, UNESCO observed an international day, World Press Freedom Day. Press freedom. Why does UNESCO take particular interest in press freedom?
Well, maybe I can start providing some contributions to this. Well, press freedom, media communications is the fourth mandate vested with UNESCO, and indeed St. Kitts and Nevis has benefited in the past from funding to train journalists here on the ground, I think at least on 2 occasions. But a growing concern across the world about the impediments or obstacles facing journalists in exercising their normal duties. We've had some very recent sad examples of this in Europe, Latin America and elsewhere. UNESCO's role is to ensure that journalists, accredited journalists, have the freedom, have the ability to be able to exercise their profession without fear of any sanctioning, or indeed, worse again, threats of violence or injury to the journalist, as it were, core. And indeed, sadly, every year there isn't a month that doesn't go by when there's a journalist reported killed in the course of their duty. Now, this is not a particular, happily this is not a phenomenon that we experience very often across the Caribbean, happily. But there are other countries where it does, and this is where UNESCO believes that all of the member states, all 192 member states, should sign up to as it were, a memorandum of understanding to ensure that governments provide the necessary freedoms for journalists to exercise their métier.
Here concerning the development of communication, especially in mass communication. We talked about the IPDC program, and both opportunities were taken by the University of the West Indies. First of all, they were training women, in particular, building for female journalists, capacity building for female journalists and media managers, and that happened sometime in 2019. And then we had another one, the contending with fake news and disinformation during the pandemic, and we really grabbed those opportunities, and you must have benefited from that as well, Mr. Williams. And we were able to make sure that our journalists were tooled up in terms of being able to prepare information in a reasonable way. And as Dr. Doyle said, UNESCO is basically concerned with the non-stifling, if you want to call it, of the media persons as they go about doing their business, and to keep them safe while they do that and bring information to us in a timely and a proper manner.
Right. I know that on the 15th of September that UNESCO also observes the International Day of Democracy. And truth be told, there can be no real democracy without freedom of the press.
Yes.
Both are tied together. The press is so important in terms of holding government to account, in terms of their public accountability to the people, their transparency and their good governance and all of that. And it is the fourth estate. It is one of the arms of government, perhaps the most important arm of government, but people sometimes do not see it that way. And I think the press needs to understand its role and the importance of its role in terms of upholding those very fundamental principles of democracy. Accountability, transparency, good governance, and so on. Very, very important. Now, education, Ms. Warner. How is UNESCO impacting education in the Federation?
Well,
since that is one of this, education, it's science, and it's culture.
Education in St. Kitts and Nevis is taking a forward step, especially with the assistance of UNESCO. We are at the point now where we are talking about professionalizing the teaching force. So far, we have been able to, with UNESCO's help, develop a national, put things in place to begin to develop a National Teaching Council. We have Mrs. Carla Diamond, who is the focal point for that project, and we have successfully completed the guidelines, operational guidelines, and the regulatory guidelines to begin to do that. Now, coming out of this new project that we have submitted just recently, we are looking at the professionalization and the standardization of the teaching force in St. Kitts and Nevis. So we're moving towards that, talking about licensure and all kinds of regulations where you have to make sure that you are keeping up with the training and the modern trends in education. And so the council will monitor all of that and make sure that everybody is on board and up to par, paying of fees and so on. So we're getting going into international waters where we're looking at best practices across education and tooling up and coming up to mark with everybody else. So we're heading there.
Right.
Yes, if I could just add to that, the background to St. Kitts and Nevis's very mature relationship with UNESCO on the education agenda goes back to 2016 when UNESCO, we requested UNESCO to undertake an independent and very in-depth study into the education strategy of the Federation. It took 18 months. The consultants came here on the ground. They interviewed, reviewed documents, and produced what was actually at the time, and still is, the first ever independent review of educational strategy in the GRULAC region, that is to say, the group of Latin American, Central American, and Caribbean states. So we're particularly proud to have been chosen as the object of this particular very in-depth study. Now, out of the study came obviously a lot, the identification of a number of shortcomings. One perhaps I won't say that it was the most important. There were 4 or 5 critical elements that needed to be addressed in urgency. But the first one was the professionalization of the teaching staff. UNESCO, for instance, discovered that over 80% of the current teaching force did not actually have a formal qualification. And there was no evidence of any continuing professional education, training, etc., etc. So one of the current projects that we are seeking technical assistance from UNESCO on is indeed this question of professionalization of teachers. The consultants will be returning very soon again towards the end of the year from UNESCO to St. Kitts and working with this, as Ms. Warner says, in creating a teachers council, a national teachers council, which will set the standards, will set the overall broad direction of how curriculum should be reviewed, updated, but also there will be standards set in terms of minimum standards in terms of what one requires to be able to teach. Now there will obviously have to be, and there will indeed be, a certain grandfathering, as it were, clause to ensure that those who are already working as teachers can continue to do so while it's at the same time receiving on-the-job training, as it were, on a regular basis. So that's number one. The other area that that UNESCO identified as lacking was a structured accreditation policy for higher level qualifications. Now, the Accreditation Council does exist, but UNESCO felt that needed to be reformed, it needed to be strengthened, it needed to be scaled up, and have real powers to be able to, with structured, internationally led standards in terms of criteria as to what qualifications would meet the grade and which don't. So the accreditation project again will be the object of intervention by UNESCO towards the end of this year, which will see the creation, or at least the reform and the strengthening of the existing accreditation board. It will be made up of 2/3 of local citizens, 1/3 from outside of St. Kitts and Nevis. There's also talk about merging the TVET, the current TVET accreditation structure with that of the other qualifications, and there will be a separate, as it were, structure and vehicle to take into account the offshore medical colleges, which are, as you know, are very prominent here. And last but not least, ESD, integrating sustainable education for sustainable development, integrating education for sustainable development into the curriculum. And indeed, again, this is where St. Kitts and Nevis is leading the way in terms of other small island developing states across the Caribbean, in that we will probably be the first English-speaking Caribbean state to actually integrate ESD into its curriculum going forward.
Right. Now, UNESCO has a number of culture conventions, and these conventions have helped in the protection and preservation of the natural and cultural heritage of the world. Now, Mrs. Wallace, in recent times, the MAB, Man and the Biosphere project, has been gaining a lot of attention, and rightly so. Could you tell us what has been UNESCO's role in that project?
As a matter of fact, UNESCO have played a very integral role in terms of the implementation of these projects, because the funding from UNESCO Paris comes to our National Commission for UNESCO and is managed by the National Commission for UNESCO. But more importantly, the MAB is at the community level, and any intervention at the community level impacts on the bread and butter and the environment of our local people. And when you look at the grassroots of effect of UNESCO at the community level, you would see, because of the projects that have been implemented, for example, when you talk about education, part of all of the processes that go into effect at the community level involves education and sensitization. When you look at being able to appreciate the community and being able to look at the community in a different light, develop more pride, develop more appreciation, because the communities are impacted over a long period of time. And so over the period of, from the time of the inscription, which was in 2011, until now, there have been several important interventions. When you go around the island, you would see the sign walls that are up. We have 3 of them throughout the MAB area, And then more recently, we have gone more in depth as to looking at the Keon River and the importance of the Keon River to the community and the country as a whole. And we have again erected signage for it is educational, and also it is an awareness that we can no longer dump things indiscriminately in the waterway. So yes, UNESCO have been impacting and is impacting the community in a very positive way. Yes.
Right. So UNESCO, the work of UNESCO is actually being seen through the committee, the MAB committee, and they have offered funding because of their interest really in the preservation and the protection of that natural resource, the man and the biosphere that has a lot of flora and fauna, and yes, and the environment.
Yes, and
Right.
I think even looking at young people, the young persons who have benefited from the intervention at the primary school level and at the high school level, this information will stay with them for life, because we are looking at behavior change. We are looking at buying, and when these young persons are so enthused and so looking forward to doing more of what we have been doing, which is we are training them, and they have been very involved because it is participatory. So they have been very active, and I feel very proud of the work that as the MAB National Committee we have been doing at the community level, and I think we are going in the right direction by involving all of society approach. As Secretary General always say, we're looking at an all of society approach, and the all of society approach involves from the very young to the elderly, and we are very pleased, and we are looking forward to our very next intervention that will go more in depth into the elimination of the single-use plastics, the sensitization of not just the community but the country as a whole in the elimination, and the sensitization about the effects, the long-reaching effects of the use of single-use plastics. And so with these type of interventions, we're looking at behavior change, we're looking at assessments of what is going on, how people feel about it, their knowledge and their attitude. And so the intervention from UNESCO is very far-reaching.
Yes, absolutely. And let me just add to that. Before doing so, let me pay a special tribute to Ms. Wallace for her Trojan efforts. Since the instigation of the Man and Biosphere, she's been consistently liaising and intervening on this particular project. Now, we were inscribed on the Man and Biosphere list in 2011. We've received, from memory, 3, if not 4, separate packages of technical expertise, including funding. Probably the 2 most important to date was the development of a marketing and management plan with respect to the Man and Biosphere site in Keon, which took 2.5 years, followed more recently by a very successful cleaning up and beautification of the Keon region, which went extremely well in spite of all the obstacles that Ms. Wallace and her colleagues faced given the COVID restrictions. And now we're taking this to a much more game-changing level, in my view. This is the first time, I think, in the history of our relationships with UNESCO where we are being encouraged to consider the creation ultimately of a plastic-free zone covering the entire Man and Biosphere site in St. Mary's. So next year, if we get the funding, as I believe we will be holding a very extensive 2-day conference with all of the stakeholders across the Federation, government ministries, youth, NGOs, and also those companies, private and otherwise, that deal with water-related issues, to look at ways of mapping out the measures that are going to be needed to transform over a certain period of time Keon and St. Mary's into a plastic-free zone. Now, not many other member states in the Caribbean have done this, but we have an example of a very successful implementation in Saint Thomé and Principe, two very small Portuguese-speaking islands off the coast of Africa, who over a period of time transformed the entire two islands into a plastic-free zone very successfully. But you know, it's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen by chance. It needs structured plans and measures. It needs commitment by everybody, top-down, bottom-up approach, to achieve the optimal results going forward.
Now, Ms. Warner, a month, in the next month, 1 month away actually, UNESCO will celebrate World Environment Day. And since the environment is so important, is there anything that UNESCO is planning to do here, the local commission, to celebrate World Environment Day and link in with, for example, the Department of Environment or the MAB committee to build awareness in terms of the importance of the environment and how it should be preserved and protected?
I'm happy that you asked that, Mr. Williams, because in terms of UNESCO, UNESCO is all about partnership. SDG 17 is about partnership, and we're happy to have Ms. Wallace here from the MAB, and we are happy to know that the MAB committee itself is made up of so many different persons and departments, different entities that partner with us. We have Ms. Lynelle Bonaparte, who is from the Department of Environment. We have NAMA from the solid waste, and we have persons from health, etc. We have the Turtle Monitoring Network. We have all kinds of different persons who represent different entities that speak to the preservation of the environment. And so we at UNESCO, we speak about celebration days. We have actually put out a calendar of celebration days. That is not one of on our calendar, but as you speak about it, we of course will rally the different departments to see what is it that they can do to keep the idea of preserving the environment in the fore towards the people of St. Kitts Nevis, letting them know that it's important to preserve not only the reserve but the environment in general, and how the misuse of plastic, the actual throwing down of garbage indiscriminately and so on, can hurt the environment. And so we want to bring everybody on board, the media, in terms of, you know, putting the word out there as to how we go about it. So it's partnerships all around, and of course preserving the environment is something that we would want to ensure that everybody is on board when it comes to that. Yes.
Okay, a lot has been, a lot of focus has been placed on our tangible cultural heritage. Those things that we can touch and we can see and we can feel, and things like that. Type of the clothing that we wear, the foods that we eat and things like that. But UNESCO now has a particular focus on intangible cultural heritage. You know, while we talk about the food, yes, we see and we eat the food, but what about the recipe? How it is being prepared. You know, if nobody actually writes that down, then it is completely lost. So what can you say to us, Dr. Doyle, in terms of the long and fruitful journey to preserve our intangible cultural heritage in St. Kitts and Nevis?
Well, we are already well advanced in the last 3 years as a result of technical expertise and funding that was provided by UNESCO, which consisted of, as it were, what we refer to as the indigenous knowledge. That indeed, as you say, Mr. Williams, if it's not documented, it's lost. So the first 2 or 3 years of the Intangible Cultural Heritage Project here in St. Kitts, led by Marlene Phillips and Patrick Howard in Nevis, separately, looked at interviewing across the Federation people that had grown up with and preserved local indigenous knowledge. But this consists of areas like food, culture, language, songs, musical instruments, even local medical non sort of chemical remedies, which, if they're not identified early enough, documented properly and preserved, they will disappear. So the next step indeed is going to be moving to a structured intangible cultural heritage policy framework, which will be formally recognized by the government, and with the help of UNESCO, we will then be asked to actually draw up a list of those intangible cultural heritage elements and items. So there's going to be great competition between everybody in the Federation to make sure that they have inscribed their intangible cultural heritage item, and this ultimately will gain universal recognition across the globe by being inscribed on the UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage list. Now, there's obviously a preservation, conservation element for the purposes of dexterity, but also there is the other element, which is tourism, that we perhaps should be doing more to promote and raise the awareness of the intangible cultural nature of St. Kitts and Nevis, which is very unique. Transform it into a tourist attraction. There are income generating opportunities. There are opportunities for training young people who can guide tourists and provide explanations as to the origin and the nature of these particular intangible cultural items. So I feel very optimistic that by 2024 we will have a very structured intangible cultural heritage program in place. I'm very confident that with the highly competent two focal persons here on the ground who've done a wonderful job, I must again mention them, Mr. Williams, Marlene Phillips and Patrick Howell. Both of them have worked under very difficult conditions during the COVID lockdown. They still went out and held meetings virtually, filmed, interviewed people, and so on. And actually, in the process of doing so, they were able to avail of UNESCO funding to buy cameras and recording material of some value, which again came from UNESCO. Without that particular material, they would not have been able to undertake the role. So hopefully we will be receiving the next tranche of $100,000 US, which will take us just a little bit further in terms of the real materialization of an intangible cultural heritage policy framework.
Mm-hmm. The ambassador was able to do a walkthrough of the ICH Secretariat established in St. Kitts in the Department of Culture, and there's the acting manager there, Miss Jacqueline Harvey, who was able to give him an idea of the tapes and the recordings of the different things that are already in store. We have, for example, the folk medicine that he mentioned, the folk dances, the Nevis pottery is something that they are promoting over Nevis as a cultural item, and the prickly pear would be the focus of the medicine that they are looking at. And so all the broom making in St. Kitts, the sugar cake making, and those are things that we want to preserve, identify and preserve them and put them there as our cultural heritage items. And the knowledge bearers, those who were interviewed, and they are icons in and of themselves, in their own right. They have this knowledge and they want to share it with us, and instead of, going off and, leaving us empty-handed, they're willing to impart this knowledge to us, and as you said, to train young people to be able to know these things and do these things in the future, and to be able to market them and encourage tourists to get the information and be a part of everything that we do here.
Right. I also know that UNESCO is very much involved in the promotion of the youth, the arts as well. Of course, we know we have Department of Youth here in St. Kitts. There's one in Nevis. We also have a ministry that was recently created, and the Ministry of Entertainment and Talent Development, Entrepreneurship. How is UNESCO supporting the arts here in the Federation, and what more can be done for the support of the arts?
I would say that UNESCO is very supportive, as you say, of youth. We partner with the directors of youth on both St. Kitts and Nevis, Mr. Liebird and Ms. Clark in Nevis. We work with them very closely. We are able to disseminate information to them from UNESCO, get young people to be a part of different forums here and there and everywhere to be able to gain capacity. And there's a celebration of World Youth Day, I think it's the 12th of August, and so we make sure that the youths are impacting there and they have things that they can do to showcase their talents, etc. You mentioned the creation of the new ministry, the Assistant Secretary, Ms. Keisha Adams. Yes, she is very much a part of what we do. Even in the celebration of the UNESCO Days, she is very much keen to be able to be able to prepare programs to bring the youth on board. I remember just last month we celebrated World Poetry Day, and I was really intrigued to be a part of the program in the square, where I would say 90% of the performances were by young people, and the depth of their poetry was really, really captivating. So the youth, they are in there with us, and we want to make sure that they are there because they are the ones who are going to ensure the sustainability of the activities of UNESCO. So we promote youth activities, and especially in the sports, all these social sciences we're promoting, they are actually for the youth who will carry things forward. So.
If I could just add to that youth is one of the global priorities at UNESCO, along with gender equality, Africa, and hopefully soon the small island developing states. But youth is an integral part of all of the activities. It's mainstreamed across the entire 5 areas of expertise: culture, education, natural science, and information. And indeed, Ms. Warner and I, from experience, know that every time we submit a proposal to UNESCO for technical assistance and funding, whether it's under the participation program or otherwise, there has to be a youth dimension. And indeed, UNESCO ask us, if they're not satisfied, they ask us, so where does the youth feature in this particular project? And an interesting, more recent example of this was the other project we're working on, anti-doping in sports. And again, where we are working with the Ministry of Sports to elaborate a proposal in the next month, I think, actually, so we haven't got much time, with a view to seeking technical expertise to raise the awareness of dope-free sport amongst the youth. Now, the youth are fundamental to this. It's an integral part of the program, and in the proposal we have to quantify how many youth are going to be involved, at what level, what ages, across the 2 islands, across St. Kitts and Nevis. So there's no getting away from the fact, no concealing from the fact that youth is an integral part of every activity we undertake, as is, by the way, gender equality.
Is the UNESCO SKN Student Strong, naturally, and that's a a fund of some $35,000 that US dollars that we are seeking to make sure that the students, the schools are prepared to push the students forward.
That's right.
Yes.
Dr. Doyle, you are our ambassador, the Federation's ambassador to UNESCO, which is headquartered in Paris, France. And you are a Frenchman?
No.
Not really.
French. Not
You're
French.
not French.
No, I'm not French. Irish.
You are Irish, but nonetheless very versed in French and what's not. And could you tell us a little bit in terms of St. Kitts and Nevis at the international level in terms of UNESCO? There's an executive board of UNESCO. Are we a part of that executive board? When did we join? Tell us a little bit in terms of your representation of the Federation at the international level. And perhaps how you are trying to raise the profile of St. Kitts and Nevis at the transnational level via this United Nations educational, scientific, and cultural organization.
Thank you for the question. Well, St. Kitts and Nevis joined UNESCO, I think, a month after it became independent in 1983. So we were the new nation. I think recognized almost immediately the virtues of joining the transnational, international community by joining the UN and certain selective UN agencies, notably UNESCO. So we've been active since 1983. And indeed, St. Kitts and Nevis has actively participated in the deliberations, discussions on strategy, on new orientations at UNESCO headquarters in Paris. We've sat on the executive board, which is the highest, as it were, decision-making body in the organization, made up of 52 member states on two occasions, 2005 to 2009 or 10 from memory, and again for 4 years until 2017. So we've gone through a baptism of fire, as it were, in terms of sitting on the board, and there was a very steep learning curve, I seem to remember the time. At the time, it was Miss Warner's predecessor, Antonia Maynard, who was the Secretary General of the National Commission. He would come to Paris to attend these meetings on a twice yearly, and he and I worked very, very closely together in terms of contributing to the debates. Now, what we discovered, I think, very early on, was that because we are a small island developing state, one of the smallest in the Western world, we don't always get an opportunity to raise our views. We tend to get obscured by a lot of noise that goes on around in other areas as well, in the UN, in the European Union, and we don't always get an opportunity to raise our voice and our concerns about the challenges and vulnerabilities that small island developing states face. And this UNESCO, as it were, experience, going back to 2006, where we were sitting on the executive board, allowed us the opportunity, for the first time ever, to really raise the stakes on behalf of St. Kitts and Nevis. And also, not just on behalf of St. Kitts and Nevis, but actually also on behalf of all of the 38 small island developing states. And very early on in 2006, just after I was accredited as your ambassador, which I would underline, I'm doing pro bono, and have been doing so since then. I instigated and created the first ever SIDS Committee of Representatives to UNESCO. on the basis that we needed to have a common voice to be able to speak to the administration, UNESCO, about the core challenges facing our island states, sustainability, climate change, rising water levels, groundwater shortages, educational challenges because of our remoteness, etc. We all know the arguments. But this enabled us, St. Kitts and Nevis, to be able to articulate our views at a very senior level. We also sat for 4 years on the World Heritage Committee, and this is a particular pride to me because we lobbied very heavily to get ourselves positioned to take a seat on this body, which is the single most influential, most difficult body to actually get a seat on. But we got in by 3 votes, I might add. But it was worth the effort and the lobbying, because it meant for 4 years St. Kitts and Nevis representatives, notably Percival Hanley, who sat on the committee on behalf of the Federation, we were able to participate very actively in the debates, improving, for instance, the criteria for the selection of World Heritage Sites. And also, it enabled us, since we were sitting at the same table as some of the big players in the cultural heritage domain, Brazil, Argentina, the United States, France, Germany, Japan, South Korea, we were able to share perspectives with them, and also persuade some of these countries to help us by providing technical expertise, which indeed Brazil has just done. Last summer, the government of Brazil wrote to the government of St. Kitts and Nevis, offering their expertise in the field of cultural heritage. So again, we benefited enormously from that particular presence on the committee. What do I do as the ambassador to UNESCO? How do I go about raising our profile? Well, let me first of all explain that my background is a long-standing, I guess, seasoned diplomat. My career was spent with the Irish Diplomatic Service, the Trade Mission, the OECD, and the European Parliament, and then I was asked to assume the role as ambassador of St. Kitts and Nevis to UNESCO. Now, I run a very tight show. I don't have any staff, but that doesn't prevent us from, as we've just described during this program extensively, securing and implementing technical assistance here on the ground in areas like education, culture, man and biosphere, groundwater resources. And we do so because we have a presence in Paris. You can go and see the key experts, you can explain the situation, and you can also negotiate with some of the better endowed member states, such as Brazil, who must be thanked for their extreme generosity in providing us with this level of expertise, which we simply just didn't have here. The other area that I think it's important to point out, again, going back to this concern that we don't always have a voice around the table at big fora, whether it's in New York or Brussels or Paris or elsewhere. One of the areas that I put a lot of emphasis on is securing speaking roles for government ministers. In the last 2 years, in spite of the restrictions imposed by COVID, which meant that sadly none of us could travel, I was able to secure speaking roles for the Prime Minister, for Minister Brantley, for Minister Richards, for Minister Powell, at various international fora, notably the UN, to speak about issues like groundwater challenges we're having. How did St. Kitts and Nevis manage deal with the restrictions imposed by COVID in terms of education? So we were able to provide a very distinctly small island developing state perspective which other member states don't have, to many of these speaking roles. And indeed, very often we found that St. Kitts and Nevis and the minister speaking were the only representatives from small island developing states. So it's through those particular vehicles, Mr. Williams, that we in St. Kitts and Nevis have managed to get ourselves on the map and hit well above our weight in terms of articulating our particular position on a range of issues as it relates to the UNESCO mandate.
Mrs. Wallace?
Yes. I just wanted to, at this point, thank you, Ambassador, because Ambassador Doyle have worked tirelessly on behalf of our federation. The amount of things that he gets done, you would think he has a full staff, a big office and full staff. And I have worked with Ambassador for the past, since 2009, because I've been a volunteer of UNESCO since 2009. And he is, you know, when you say ambassador, is usually in that capacity of His Excellency. Ambassador Doyle is like my next door neighbor who I get along with. And he is always an email or a phone call away. Whenever we are developing any project for submission, Ambassador would do clerical work. He will do anything to make sure that our project reach there. He has done, I mean, you have done so much for our federation in terms of not just the ministers, but our technical people on the ground. I have been to South Korea on Jeju Island because of the hard work of Ambassador Doyle, and not just myself, but others who are volunteers of UNESCO. And I really want to thank you for, as a Kittitian, that we have someone who is working on our behalf, who considers, well, I consider you to be a Kittitian, who considered himself to be a Kittitian, and up to the other day I welcome him home because he treats us as if this is his home, and we really do appreciate that. Yes.
Right now, Warner, we hear a lot of the UNESCO and their national commissions, because I take it that UNESCO has a number of national commissions. Now, and those national commissions would complement, of course, they have some sort of reporting mechanism and what they're doing. And could you tell us a little bit about your work at the National Commission as the Secretary General?
My work is all-encompassing, and I like to tell people that I work in every ministry or department in St. Kitts and Nevis, because so many things pass across my desk, and which I have to disseminate to other ministries or to take from them and relay back to UNESCO, etc., etc. So my work is very, very broad, and you hear about culture, you hear about sports, you hear about MAB, there's so many different things that we do. My staff is small, it's just my project officer, my secretary, and my messenger, but we are able to get the support of the members of the National Commission, which are, of course, government entities. We have people from the different ministries who are part of the National Commission who pour into our office. I'm not expert on any particular thing that we have to report on, but I know where to tap. I can tap into, you know, Marlene Phillips or Mills, Troy Mills at Culture. I can tap into Sean Seabrooks or Charles Morton or whatever for sports. So we take from them and we send out. We have people in education like Dr. Esdale, Chris Herbert, and so on. Those persons were experts in their own right who feed information back to us. We get information from them and we send out. So we are just a hub per se for information that UNESCO needs. We put people in touch with the UNESCO activities, and so more and more everybody is realizing that UNESCO is not just the Secretariat or Dorothy Warner. UNESCO is all of us, and this is what I want people to know, that at some point in time, we all work for UNESCO, whether we like it or not, because there are so many different entities that UNESCO focuses on. I call on you, Mr. Williams, all the time. We are in constant contact when I need anything. And so we are just out there putting our hands in everybody's pot and making sure that everybody is a part of of the whole mix of UNESCO, St. Kitts and Nevis. So it's broad and it's deep, but we have the persons we can call on to get the information out there whenever we need it. Yes.
I like something that Dr. Doyle said in terms of a small island developing states. Sometimes we do not have a voice at the big table. And decisions are being made and they are being imposed upon us. But we must have a voice. It doesn't matter if our voice is a small voice. We have a voice and we must be heard. And I think that that is where, you know, your representation and your very noble representation of the Federation is very important.
I agree. I don't think it's a question of being small or big in terms of the voice. It's a question of selectivity. We've got to be selective about where we should be at a certain point in time on important subjects. The subjects such as sustainable development, youth education, groundwater related issues. We just must make sure that we are at the right time at the right place with a consistent, well articulated position. Which is why, again, I go back to what I said earlier, the importance of our ministers being invited to speak at international fora. A recent example was Minister Richards, whom I've asked on at least 3 occasions in the last year to speak at UN events on water, groundwater, and he spoke at one very recently held in Senegal, virtually that is, what they call UN water, on this question notably of what is the specific challenges facing small island developing states. You know, rising sea levels is only one of the issues we face, but what a lot of people do not understand within the large international organizations when they look at rolling out development plans is the degree, because of our smallness, surrounded by water, rising sea levels very quickly translates into contamination of water, which is at a very extremely high, dangerous level in many of the 38 small island states spread across the globe. So it's important that, and indeed Minister Richards did make this point, at a UN Water Year 2022 conference in just before we left. Groundwater Making the Invisible Visible was the name of the of this particular event, which brought ministers from Africa, Latin America, and St. Kitts and Nevis, but we were the only ones there at the table to talk and speak up about challenges facing small island states. So it's critically important. So yes, within UNESCO it's important on a selective basis. Equally important in the UN in New York, also in Brussels, where the European Union. Don't forget, the European Union is the largest single multilateral funding mechanism in the world. They've just closed down their last EDF program. 30 billion euros was destined for for this particular region. They've just recently, the European Commission has just recently restructured its EDF program, its European Development Fund, And we need to have a presence in Brussels to make sure that small island developing states can articulate the concerns, the priorities, and seek the appropriate and timely technical assistance that's needed. The other thing I would mention, Mr. Williams, and it's increasingly obvious to me, is that many of the donor nations, bilateral or multilateral, are clearly much more interested in regional-wide initiatives. We are sadly, I think, probably moving away from, single state interventions. Why? Logically, because many of the small island developing states, whether it be in the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, or the Caribbean, suffer from the same problems, albeit there are different levels of evolution in terms of the processes that are needed to resolve some of these issues. But quite visibly, the example of the European Development Fund, it's been reformed to ensure that the expertise and the funding focuses on regional or sub-regional wide activities, sustainable development, environmental protection, groundwater related issues, and that's where we need to, again, I think, plug ourselves into the right mechanisms to make sure that we have a voice at the table.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Doyle. We are going to go to the phone lines. Of course, this is a call-in program, and to hear what questions people may have, or suggestions or comments. The numbers to call are 466-2666, that is 466-2666, 662-8674, 662-8674, 767-4765, 767-4765, and the international number is 1-239-645-4500. That is 1-239-645-4500. We welcome your calls. Right. Dr. Doyle, how is UNESCO funded? Through its members?
Yes, it's like any international organization of the UN. It's funded primarily through the member states, the 192 member states. The United States left UNESCO some 6 years ago. They paid the lion's share of the budget. That shortfall has since been made up through voluntary contributions and the increase of contributions voluntarily by other member states. But increasingly what we're seeing is, and this is a phenomenon that we see in every UN agency, which is an increasing proportion of the funding comes from voluntary sources, from member states, well-endowed member states, I might add, but also from private donors who are interested in specifically addressing issues like climate change, youth, disaffection, or addressing issues such as the groundwater policy. So it's true that Cinques y Neves does benefit from also that particular mechanism. It's a different mechanism. It's less predictable, obviously, because the bulk of the budget is paid by member states. It's based on the GDP, relative GDP levels, and there's a certain degree of predictability about this, whereas voluntary contributions, well, they come and go.
Right, so UNESCO is responsible for disbursing funds to various countries. How is that done, and in terms of priorities and so on? Right. Who gets what?
Yeah, well, let's perhaps treat that particular statement. How does UNESCO disperse its funds? And actually, UNESCO is not a funding agency. Right. It's not like the IMF. It has a relatively small budget for the purposes of providing technical assistance as it does to St. Kitts and Nevis. No, its major, I think, contribution is in terms of technical expertise. You know, we can call upon experts across the globe at very short notice, as is the case in St. Kitts and Nevis. We found ourselves, Ms. Warner will tell you, with the Sports National Policy Project, which had to be delayed because of COVID, what was it, 2 years ago? All we had was 4 months left to be able to complete the project with a consultant. You know, UNESCO very quickly kicked into action, deployed a key expert. That expert was on the ground within 48 hours here, completed the project on time within the budget. But again, you know, UNESCO's main contributing factor is not money. It's not a funding agency. You know, it's not an aid agency. It provides expertise. Technical expertise, yeah.
Technical assistance. Right. Now, in terms of the relationship between St. Kitts and Nevis and UNESCO, where more would you like to see it go? What still you think needs to be done to further, to enhance that relationship? In any relationship, of course, you know, you want it to get from being good to better, and from better to being best. So what more can be done?
Well, I think my starting point would be to say that we have a very mature relationship with UNESCO. You know, I won't deny that being on the ground helps enormously. You know, that face-to-face contact. I'm sorry, I'm a bit of an old-fashioned ambassador. I do still believe in face-to-face contacts and not this faceless virtual communication. My two grown-up girls laugh at me when I say that, but I still believe that you can get an awful lot more done through face-to-face contacts, meeting people physically, and you can work out an awful lot of the nagging, outstanding issues through dialogue in that way. But so I don't think we need to change anything in the architecture or the way we present ourselves. I think it's optimal. It works very well for us. We both Ms. Warner and I, Ms. Wallace, are always very glad that UNESCO responds very promptly to any of our requests, and that I think is a reflection on the maturity of our relationships. What more could we be doing? Clearly, we could be perhaps seeking a seat on UNESCO committees. We've just stood down from the World Heritage Committee. After 4 years, we've already sat on the UNESCO Executive Board on 2 occasions. But that comes with downsides, which is it's hugely time-consuming. It absorbs an awful lot of your time to the detriment of other activities, lobbying to seek funding for man and biosphere and other activities. But clearly, next year we will be revisiting a range of UNESCO committees where St. Kitts and Nevis, in my view, could offer an interesting perspective. One of them actually is man and biosphere. I think it's probably our time that St. Kitts and Nevis secured a seat on the Man and Biosphere Committee. Very few small island states have that privilege. We are the first English-speaking Caribbean state to have a man and biosphere site. So we've got a certain privileged sort of background we're coming from. So I think that might be something worth investigating, and that would enable Miss Wallace to travel to Paris every 2 years to attend some of these meetings. What else can we do? Well, clearly there are activities, there are conventions we've signed up to. We've mentioned most of them already today, but there's one that, there are 2 other conventions where we are making somewhat slower progress because we lack the expertise. There's a small pool of talent in all of these islands that we must recognize. This is probably the most important message we can get across to the UN, the EU, and bilateral donors. And this is why we need that expertise. But there are two areas where I believe we could usefully explore in terms of expertise. The first is diversity and cultural expressions, a convention we signed up to at the same time as the intangible cultural heritage. This is more about, creative expressions, music, dancing, folklore, of which we have abundant examples across the Federation. Now, this has proven to be a bit of a challenge for us in that we don't have expertise in this field. So we're probably going to be looking at applying for technical expertise and funding from UNESCO to have a consultant come here on the ground, work alongside a focal contact person in Nevis and somebody else in St. Kitts. So that's one area that we need to perhaps seriously consider. And the other area is underwater cultural heritage. We signed up to a convention, probably one of the first after I was accredited in 2009 from memory, protection of underwater cultural heritage. And as its name implies, it helps island states notably to identify and protect its rich underwater cultural heritage, of which St. Kitts and Nevis has quite a bit. Already in the Bay of Basse-Terre, a major battle was fought in 1782 from memory, if my history serves me right, on which and many of the French and the British ships were sunk there, so there must be a huge underwater cultural heritage that should be preserved, and this program helps member states like St. Kitts and Nevis to integrate the necessary legal instruments into local law and also train the local security, customs staff in protecting this underwater cultural heritage.
Dr. Doyle, are you aware that a lot of our cultural property are in museums in Europe?
No, I must confess I'm not. No.
A lot of the cultural property from Africa and these islands are in museums in Europe. Should they be in museums in Europe, or should they be in museums here?
Quite obviously, we should be claiming some of these artifacts, but what we need is a museum. We need a structured museum here that reflects the very unique, very diverse history of this country. It's very interesting. French, British, slave route, a bit of Spanish influence, which we need to, I think, consider very carefully. I've already spoken and continue to have a dialogue with the French government on this issue since the St. Kitts and Nevis was occupied by the French. It was Cardinal Richelieu who ordered the colonization of Saint Christophe, as they call it, in the 14th century to evangelize supposedly the population, and they stayed a long time. The vestiges of French history are everywhere to be seen, and particularly in the Madeira, absolutely. So we need to perhaps work with our partners, whether this material is in museums. To be honest, I think a lot more is probably being held in the archives of governments. Uniforms, maps, and other items could perhaps be lent to St. Kitts and Nevis and displayed on permanence as a donation by other governments, for instance.
I have seen a lot of cultural property in England and so on, in Liverpool, museums and so. There is a convention on the means of prohibiting and preventing the illicit traffic of cultural property by UNESCO. And of course, Mrs. Wallace, that is one of the things. We have to appreciate what we have in terms of our culture and to preserve it.
Yes.
The onus is on us
Yes.
to preserve it. Not necessarily somebody coming in and telling us what we have is good. We must recognize what we have is good.
That is true.
And coming from that, our recognition of what we have is good, we want to preserve that which is good and that which is our history and,
Yes.
and so on. And I do not think that we do enough of that.
Well, I think that is why implementing projects at the MAB, as a matter of fact, the MAB, we completed the MAB development plan, I think 2 years ago. 2 years ago. And as part of the MAB management plan, the appreciation of our cultural and historical artifacts is one of the things that we are asking for technical assistance. And as you say, we should not be reaching out to outside for appreciation of what we have. But we have to also realize that over the past 30 years or so, our country went into a transformation, because when we had the sugarcane, when we had the sugar estates, when our people worked in the sugar industry, I think more care was taken of everything, including, we do not look at the estates as part of our heritage. We do not put a dollar value. I said government do not put a dollar value on some of these, what we call old relics. They're not really old relics, they belong to us. And a dollar.
That history of over 400 years of sugar cane, cultivation.
Right.
And it is a large part of our history
Of
that
our-
really should be preserved and so on.
Right.
It's what we finished with sugar in 2005. It's now what, 17 years? Perhaps we should have a sugar museum.
Yes. I firmly
Something
believe
that
that.
really shows,
Yes.
people in terms of what happened here in such a large chunk of our history. From the cutting of the cane to the taking of it to the factory and so on, what happened at the factory and all of that. And that can be a tourist attraction, so people can understand our history.
Yes, as a matter of fact, when we go to other countries, we see how they uplift their history and their culture. We have so much. For just as you mentioned, our sugar journey, our journey to the development of the product of sugar, where we
African slavery, colonialism, and
coming up
all the way to independence.
At this point, we have to embrace it, because this is what we came from, and the estates and all of the things that happen, we have to embrace it, because it's our part of our history. We cannot throw it away. So therefore,
plantation was the center point of
yes,
life
for
really.
us. Yes, and we should, in fact, look at this in a dollar value. At a lot of time, we only understand the dollar value. So I would like to see a government put a cost on one of those chimneys. What is the dollar value of this chimney? And when we're looking at the checks and balances, how much does this equate to what our country is? And we preserve them because of the fact that in this world, you cannot find the chimney that is in Schooners anywhere else in the world. And so you have to put some kind of value to it, so that generations to come would understand that your forefathers went through this, and preserve this so that you can remember and appreciate. Yes.
And appreciation of what we have. And just recently we were trying to we did some cleanup at the Hermitage Estate with the view of using what used to be the cotton house there as the secretariat for the MAB. And we had visited that site, saw the potential of the property, and some months after we went back, the place had been demolished. Somebody had taken some heavy equipment and demolished the site specifically to move away with the stones. The stonework is, you know, and then we had to basically call in the National Trust, who has oversight of the property, and they were able to do a valuation of the property to realize how much it would cost to put it back in place. And we were able to nab the person who did it, but
why do you think they did it?
They did it for their own individual gain, but they also lack the knowledge. They also lack the knowledge of the value. Yes, that's right.
So therefore, we have a responsibility,
to
educate people.
I agree.
In terms of our
yes.
You know, what should be preserved and our history and all of that. Because I don't think it was something that was done, you said, for their gain, but probably if they knew
right.
the value and so on.
And how much they were impacting.
I would
because
say,
they were moving away with a big chunk of the history of that property and robbing the generations to come of their heritage.
Precisely.
Yes, so lack of knowledge.
We're basically out of time. So, you know, it's 3 minutes to 3 o'clock. Wow. But I want to ask one question of Dr. Doyle before we leave. How does UNESCO police itself in terms of achieving its goals? With all that it is doing and so on, you know, in various different countries, what is in place for it to measure how it is achieving its goals, and especially those SDGs, you know, the Sustainable Development Goals?
Yeah. Well, first of all, UNESCO works within the framework of a legal mandate that it's given. It doesn't deal with health-related issues. For instance, that's the role of the World Health Organization. It doesn't deal with food and agriculture. That's the FAO in Rome. So it really concerns itself with the strategic development, the Sustainable Development Goals, as it relates to education, culture, natural human science and information. So there may be, out of the 17 goals, there might be 7 or 8 that are very relevant, certainly 5 that are directly relevant. How does it measure its success or otherwise? Well, this is where the executive board, the executive council comes in, where St. Kitts and Nevis sat on this executive board on 2 occasions, where we spent a considerable amount of time actually reviewing past performance, not just in quantitative terms, but qualitative terms. So, you know, not just saying, well, we had 17 meetings held in Togo, in Africa. That's not what we were looking. What we were looking for was, you know, what was the net effect of this. So that's the first level, as it were, of oversight. And member states, understandably, given since the 2008 financial crisis, governments have become much more vigilant about where and how they spend the money. Multilateralism is not a popular theme in every major country in the world. I won't mention any one particular region in particular, but clearly the UN organizations, need to themselves be very vigilant about how they spend the money, because they know they're going to be questioned about how this money was spent, what were the deliverables, you know, how can you measure this, and not just in terms of the number of meetings held or the number of, you know, trade missions held, but in terms of its impact on youth, gender equality, research, standards that have been set, and, you know, all of these issues, we in St. Kitts and Nevis, and Ms. Warner and I, we can measure this. We can actually measure the tangible effects of the UNESCO activities here on the ground. Yeah, whether it's the accreditation process, professionalization of teaching staff, measuring the data on groundwater, man and biosphere. These are very tangible products. These are not about holding meetings. They're about delivering, and this is a very important message I think we need to leave the audience with today, is that we do this to ensure that we are delivering for people on the ground.
Thank you very much, Dr. Doyle, St. Kitts and Nevis's ambassador to UNESCO. I want to thank as well Mrs. Telka Wallace, who is the project coordinator for Man and the Biosphere, and our Secretary General of the National Commission for UNESCO, Ms. Dorothy Warner. Thank you to all three of you for taking time and to come here and to share on this program. Much appreciated. Thank you. I want to thank all who are listeners to today's program. We continue to appreciate your company from week to week. Next week we will be back with another Working for You program. Until then, I am Les Roy Williams. Take good care.